Thank you to the Depression Center for giving us this opportunity. As you know, today is particularly salient because we've had yet another crisis that our families and kids have been handling. Thank God, nothing bad, horribly bad happened, although I am grieving for the parents of this young woman and for her, that she didn't get the help that might have saved her life. So think about whether you want your kids to manage crisis modes well or not. That is one definition of resiliency, which is what we're going to be talking about. But rather than just react to today's events, what we'd like to do is give you an overview of how do you help your child become a more resilient, strong individual over time. This is not a quick fix. This is something that parenting is a profession. It takes a lot of intelligence, persistence, and time. And we want to give you a sense of what the research has shown have been the most helpful practices. Some of this is going to feel overwhelming because I'm going to go through a lot of these things, but I'm going to try to simplify it to the basic three. And if you could come out of here with just 3 goals of 3 parenting practices you'd like to focus on for this year with your child, that would be perfect, okay? So these are our objectives. We first want to help you think about, what does success mean? How would you know you're a successful parent or grandparent? We're going to talk about research on resiliency, and I'm going to define what that means. And we're also going to talk about how your parenting style might help your child become more resilient, okay? Let's start with the basics. I like things very basics. This was a sign up at Brown University in the 1920s when a good colleague of mine, who is now no longer alive, but was an older child psychiatrist, grew up and stumbled into in the library. And I think if you just keep these 3 things, you actually are going to be doing really well. Love your kids a lot. What it means by leaving them alone is don't overprotect them. Don't be a helicopter parent. Don't be what we call a lawnmower parent, where you're trying to mow out every obstacle in their way to make their path as clean as possible. Because those are not really that helpful for kids. And then set a good example. So we'll come back to this, but just kind of get that. Love them a lot, leave them alone, set a good example. So how do you think about what is success for your family? These are the definitions that the dictionary gives you. These are the definitions that Huffington Post might give you. But every family probably has a pretty unique definition of success. And keeping that in mind and having an idea of where you're headed, what will be a positive outcome for your child, keeps you from getting too distracted and tossed about when you hear a zillion different kinds of parenting strategies. Not every person succeeds in the same way. So one way to think about this with your family, with your kids, with your spouses, with whoever else is helping raise your kids, if you had to define your family on a bumper sticker, what would be your motto? What's the most important thing to you as a family? What would you put on that bumper sticker? You got to simplify. You don't want to have everything because nobody succeeds if they have a zillion goals, but what is kind of your basic as a family? And then resiliency is a tool that kids need, that all of us need, to bounce back to being successful, and however we define success. So it might be that, in a metal, if you compress it, it bounces back to its size. And in people, it means if you have an illness, if you have a crisis like today, if you have a move, if you transition to a new school, if all those stressors happen, can you kind of bounce back from that stressor in your life? It means being healthy in a sustained way, keeping your development more or less on a normal trajectory as much as you can. And it means thriving even when there are circumstances that are very challenging and under conditions of adversity. So, we say the same fire that melts the butter hardens the egg. Different stressors give different results in different people because they react to them differently. And you want to react in a way that's going to help your child react in a way that's going to help them more or less stay on this path to success that you have defined with them. So, sustained confidence. The Search Institute has been run out of the University of Minnesota for over 50 years. And what they have really focused on is examining what are the things that predict children who are more resilient, who are more competent, who are more confident, who bounce back better. And they've called those things that help kids be more resilient, they've called them assets. So I'm going to go through their research, and they've been compiling this research in a number of ways with over, what did I say, 44 million youth right now. And this is a system that has been widespread, used in communities, in schools, in churches, in families. You can find their information in a lot of places, and then you pick and choose which of these things might you want to build up in your child. So they have 20 assets that focus on relationships with other people, with the family, with the school, with their community. And they call those 20 assets external assets, because those are things your kids can't control. Those are things you might have control over, either in changing them or in selecting environments for your child to be in. And then there's 20 assets that are more social, emotional strengths, values, commitments, ways you spend time. And those are things you nurture in your child, but they're really internal assets, something that they keep inside of them, okay? We're going to start with the external assets, which come in these 4 main categories. So kids need support. We're going to break that down. They need to feel empowered. They need to have clear boundaries and expectations, and they need constructive use of time, which for kids of your kids' ages means parental input into that constructive use of time, not just whatever the child wants to do. Let's start with support. So again, support is not being a helicopter mom. This is a mom who's wrapping her child in bubble wrap so nothing will ever injure him, so nothing will ever give him a cut or a bruise or a scar. That is not really considered support. That is considered giving this child the message that he can't do it on his own. That's not what we're talking about here. Support could also be the other extreme. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You want to do everything on your own because I did it that way, or my grandfather did it that way. That's also not very supportive for your child. That's the extreme opposite of that. So what you want is something in the middle, keeping them above, giving them enough support that they're not going to fall. But this man in the mosh pit is still having some bit of fear. That's not the safest place to be, right? Okay, so there's support in a variety of ways. Family support, communication is supportive, having other adult relationships is really key, caring neighborhoods, school climate, and involvement with schooling. We'll go through all of these. So with the family support, what does that look like? Some of the most basic research just solidifies what traditions of most cultures have told us, is that family rituals are really important for kids to feel supported. And rituals are things like having meals together, having a set family dinner time. It might be going to church together. It might be taking vacation together. It might be every morning you walk the dog together. But having predictable rituals where it's just kind of a predictable thing that's going to happen in their life and where you might be able to hear what's on their mind is a very supportive activity. These are just some other ideas of rituals. They don't all have to be spiritual. There's lots of different ways to have family traditions and rituals, to talk about them, to keep them. This helps kids feel grounded to you, to their whole family, to their ancestors, to their community. You want support to be consistent, predictable, and reliable. So if you're a busy working family, as most of us are, you don't have 40 hours a week to spend with your child. But if they know every night at dinner, or every bedtime for 10 minutes before they go to bed, or every morning when you drive them to school, they know they have you for that predictable amount of time and that you will make yourself available to them, that is extremely protective. You want to communicate. And sometimes communicating in indirect ways is more helpful for kids. So you want to communicate daily. You want to pick those times wisely, not when they come home from school and they're really frazzled and all they want to do is just yell, if you're going to communicate back to them. But maybe when they're doing their homework, or they're coloring, or they're just sitting, going through their phone, you might be able to talk to them more about things that matter without direct, let's sit down and have this heavy discussion. Cars are a great time. Some people like to just text their kids or leave notes. That's all perfectly appropriate. When you do want to give them positive feedback, you want to be really specific. Look at them. Say, this is exactly what you did. You know what? You studied really hard for that test. You spent 3 days preparing for it. you gotta be, I'm really proud of you, all that hard work really paid off. Good job. It made me feel proud of you. It says, if I walk past your desk without stopping to criticize your work, that counts as a compliment. Obviously, that's not what we're trying to get after here. Oh. Okay, next set is empowerment. One way to feel empowered is to feel safe. Kids that don't feel safe, like today maybe, are not going to be feeling like they have power to control their environment. So you want to make your environment at home as clearly safe for them as possible, which means if you own guns, store them safely. Keep the bullets away, keep things locked up. If you don't own guns, that's great. Don't allow violence in your own home. Model. Parents get frustrated too. They can hit red zones pretty fast. You model that if I'm getting angry, if I'm getting frustrated, I'm going to take a time out and cool down before I say or do something that's going to be harmful to you or to anybody else in the family. Those are ways to help your child feel safe, and that goes into this empowerment feeling. Boundaries. Here's a great one. What are you doing on your unspoken objectives? My what? Referring to the goals I have in my mind that I've never mentioned. How are those going? I'm nailing them, you know? If you don't make it clear what you want your kids to do, they don't read your mind. They don't really know you need them to pack their school bag, pack their lunch, and be ready to go out of the house by a certain time. Set those expectations very clearly for them and be very concise. This is what we need. You don't need a paragraph. You just need, these are the 3 things I need you to do today, and be consistent with it. Choose your battles carefully. How many of you are familiar with the basket metaphor of how to pick battles? This is particularly helpful for oppositional kids, which is 80% of them, or kids in high school, okay? So there are certain issues that are non-negotiable. That's basket A. You are just not even going to fight about this. You have to wear a seatbelt. It's the law. You have to wear a seatbelt when you're in the car. If you don't put your seatbelt on, I don't start the car. Or no drugs in this house. It's against the law for you to have illegal substances at your age. We are just not allowing any drugs in this house. End of story. Then there are basket C things, lower priority behaviors. You know, you might not like that your son has dyed his hair purple, but do you really want to pick a battle about that? I mean, in the big picture, is that really going to harm him? Is that really going to be something that's that big of a deal that you might chance a meltdown if you bring that up with him? Maybe not. And then there are those basket B things. These are important things, but you have to pick your battles. You know, it's important that kids go to school. It's important that they make friends. It's important that they use their time constructively. Those are the kind of issues you might want to have discussions about, but you don't want to do it at a time it's going to cause a meltdown. You want to do it at a more appropriate time. All right, so B is the area that you do pick battles with. And constructive use of time. This is what a lot of kids feel like. They go to soccer, they go to piano, they have to do their homework, they have to be at their friend's house, they play hockey, they're running around hither and thither. This is what you feel like if you have several kids all on different schedules. And it's not a very comforting feeling to be running around and scheduled and very busy. So it's much better to have a plan, and this goes back to your theory of success, is what are the basic structured pieces of times you need to do things, and then when can you have just free time, which we know is helpful for kids. So what the Assets program has shown is that if kids have at least 3 hours a week of a variety of programs, these are some ideas, but something that they consider a creative activity like playing an instrument or dancing, or a sports activity, or a community activity like scouts or volunteering, they need about 3 hours a week of that. Okay? Some kids get much more, right? Some get less, but 3 hours seems to be the sweet spot where they do well with that. Having involvement with the religious or spiritual community is shown to be protective. Regular, frequent time spent at home, surprisingly, is good. Kids do not do well if they're out hanging with their friends every night of the school week. They suggest limiting it to 2 nights a week max, that they're just out doing whatever. And the other nights, you want to be more creative with them at home and make sure the time they have at home counts, that they're doing things that are benefiting them or helping them interact with you or the community. And we'll have some more ideas for that. Internal assets, this is where some of these come in. You want them to have positive values. You want them to be socially competent, able to interact with peers and with adults, know who they are and stick up for what they believe, and be committed to learning. So let's start with the commitment to learning. Kids that are motivated to learn on their own have a huge asset. That if a kid wants to learn about a subject and they read a book and they go for it, that's way better than giving them rewards about getting certain kinds of grades. So how do you get kids to get this learning motivation? You kind of look for the spark. When do their eyes light up? When do they get excited about something? And then you encourage that activity. It's called a spark. You can never overpraise a kid for doing well in school. You know, gosh, I'm so glad that you really like history and you've been telling me all about it. Or, you know, you focus on the process of what they talk to you about, not on the outcome, which is the grades. So things like how much work they put in, how creative they were, how many resources they used, how interesting this was for them to tell you about it. Those are things you want to constantly be picking up on and praising. The grades will follow if they have that motivation to achieve and they like to learn. School engagement, critically important. You're all doing one of those things, you know, participating in activities that are school-related or helping you be better parents. That is a way to model you think school and learning is important to your child. Being part of the PTA, being at their school activities, going to the school plays, going to the basketball games, all of those things show that you value them being involved with their school, and that is an asset for them. Positive values. The assets have shown that kids who actually care about other people do better. If they're concerned about the environment, if they're concerned about inequalities, if they're concerned about racism, if they're concerned about all sorts of things that are going on in our world, that is a mark of being a more resilient kid. So how do you model that for them? You know, what makes it interesting to you as a family? Do you pick a charity you're going to raise money for or donate to? Do you ride your bike in the Children's Hospital Courage Classic? Do you go donate your clothes or used toys or your children's clothes or used toys to Goodwill or to a crisis center? You know, how do you model for them that caring for our community, our broader community, is an important issue? That's going to teach them that this is important. Likewise, picking up on, gee, you welcomed the new kid in school. I'm really proud of you for doing that. They must have felt left out and lonely. You did a good job. Or when you hear about bullying or problems in school, praising them for when you hear them be empathic towards the kids that are being picked on or bullied, rather than just hearing the drama of it all. You want your child to have integrity. You want your child to be able to say no to drugs. You want them to say, I am going to be a good student. I am going to study. That's important to me. In some peer environments, they're going to get a lot of negative flack for that. If they stick up for a kid who's being bullied, other kids might make fun of them for doing that. If they say this isn't fair because of some racial injustice, let's say, or some child with a disability isn't allowed to play a game or do something, they might take flack for that. And you want to support that that's okay, that I am really proud you stood up for your values. I really value that you thought it was important to speak up even if you're being teased. This is how we teach integrity. And obviously honesty is a huge part of integrity. You know, this whole school scandal that we heard about parents buying their kids' way into colleges is not a good way to set a good example, right? It's not honesty. On a smaller scale, doing your third graders' math homework page for them is also not honest, and it's not a good way to support them, okay? So modeling integrity, modeling honesty, and giving them the confidence that they can do this. You'll be there. You might, you know, encourage them, but if you do their work, that's not really honest, and they're not going to feel proud of themselves for that. This is another good thing with honesty. So it starts with you guys. It starts in the home. You can blame the school, you can blame the culture, you can blame a lot of things, but if parents don't value honesty and integrity, give consequences for telling the truth, for not telling the truth, these kids are not going to learn that. You know, if your child shoplifts, which is a fairly common activity in young kids, parents who say that's wrong, we're going to go back to the store, return it, we're going to apologize, they are modeling being honest and having integrity. If they say, well, it's only worth 50 cents, don't do it again, It's not the same lesson. To a third grader, 50 cents is a lot of money, or maybe $5 now. Okay, responsibility is best taught by natural consequences. And this is where that bubble wrap parenting gets hard. You know, yes, you want your kid to get a good grade, and you know that if they left their homework at home and don't turn it in on time, they're going to get a poor grade. But if you race it to school in your car and show up in their classroom to give it to them, you're teaching them what? You know, think about what you teach them in the short run, what you teach them in the long run. But some of these natural consequences are the best ways to that's the other part of letting them alone. You know, fine, well, you got a C on that. If you would have handed it in on time, you would have had an A on it. Think about that next time you forget your paper. That's actually a good way to teach kids responsibilities. Bailing them out of trouble is not a good way to teach them that. So obviously there's some situations that are catastrophic that you might need to get involved with, but by and large, if kids are having a fight, go talk to your friend about it. You know, tell them what your side is, listen to what their side is, but you sort it out rather than having parents get on the phone and make it an issue. There's sometimes you have to get involved. If a kid is really being bullied badly in school, you do need to make sure that the school knows about it, you're working with the school, but you still want to give your child the message they can manage this, and so you're going to expect them to take responsibility for some of that. Whatever a child can do on their own, they should be doing on their own. So if you have, it starts with the very young age. If you have a 4-year-old who can tie their shoes, but it takes them about 10 minutes to do it, it's better to let them tie their shoes and not rush them along and do it for them, because at a very early age, they're getting the sense, I can do this and I'm responsible for this. So think about what tasks are important for each age child and hold them to that. They have to be responsible for certain actions. Social competencies. So thinking about long-term planning. You know, this comes into homework all the time, and it gets more complex as kids get older. When you're in grade school, you have an assignment, it's usually due the next day, very seldom later than that. Middle school, you might have some assignments that are going to be due in 2 or 3 days, or you might have a test at the end of the week that you know about 5 days in advance, but nobody's telling you the night before. So thinking about how do you help them figure that out, that if they want to play every day of the week and leave all that work to the last day, they might not do so well on that school thing, is one way to think about, help them manage long-term planning. You want to have a play date with Tommy on Thursday, you have a test on Friday, don't you think you might want to get your studying done before Thursday then? And you can negotiate with kids about that, but helping them start learning that. Obviously respecting other people and their rights, but thinking about increasing responsibility as they get older, as they're ready to. This is the way you're teaching them about long-term planning. Cultural competence. This world needs more people who accept a lot of different kinds of people, right? We have all sorts of wars and terrorism and things going on because we're so willing to point the problem at another person or see them as different than us and be afraid of them. Anything you can do to increase your kids' cultural competency is going to make them more successful, because the world is going to continue to be more and more of a melting pot despite what some of our current political climate might suggest. We don't want to have a divisive society. We want kids to be able to welcome each other. How can you expose kids to other cultures? How can you talk about them? You know, there are ways to travel if you can do that. There are ways to invite people of different nationalities, races, religions, socioeconomic levels over to your house, particularly if your kid's in a more integrated school. There are ways to think about other religions, learn about other religions, tour them. But the more you can just accept that not everybody is like me in this world, and you can learn to like other people, it's really a very valuable skill for your kids. I remember traveling to Italy with my kids when they were 5 and 7, and my parents when they were 75 and 77. And my kids were fine with learning a few simple phrases in Italian so that they could buy gelato. So, due gelate, por favor. And that would get them all this positive feedback, and they'd get their ice cream. My parents were like, why don't these people speak English? You know, they weren't exposed early enough that other people just do things differently. Okay, resistance skills. This is the say no. So kids can resist negative peer pressure, and they do it better if they know what your expectations are and if you're giving them positive support to do that. Talking about nonviolent ways to resist are good. You know, if other kids are smoking and they say, do you want to smoke? You can say, I'm not interested, and walk away. You don't have to cause a big to-do about it. You don't have to tell them how bad it is. You can just turn around and leave. Sometimes you have to be assertive. Seeing another kid take drugs to the point that they're not functioning, you might need to say, you know what, that's hurting you. That's not a good thing for you to be doing, and I'm not going to do it either. Sometimes getting trained peer mediation, depending on your high school, if you're settling conflicts with other peers, is a good thing. But teach your child that peers who try to pull them into behaviors that you don't approve of and that are probably harmful to them is not necessarily the best peer group that they should be in. That watching who your kid hangs out with tells you a lot about where they're feeling with their self-esteem, where their risk factors are. And that gets more important as they get older. So the older they get, especially teenage years, the more their peer pressure is a force that you have to be reckoning with. As a parent, you want to help them make good choices with friends and talk about why you like one friend or their choices better than another group of kids and their choices. Communicating to them. Sex, alcohol, drugs, pregnancy, STDs, school shootings, these are all issues your kids are facing, and they're hearing a lot about it and they're reading a lot about it on the internet. This is a good way to just have a calm conversation, not in the midst of being afraid that your child is going to be smoking pot or something, but ahead of time. You know, what do you know about smoking pot when you're 15? What do you know about what it does to the brain? What do you know about pregnancy? You know, how do kids get pregnant? My son, who's got his PhD in anthropology, did a huge project on Columbia University's campus about sexual assault on campus. These are elite kids that get into a very high university. And he was astounded at the lack of just basic knowledge about sex that these students were getting in high school or from their families. Many of them came into college not having a clue about how you get pregnant, not having a clue about contraceptives, how they work, what the options were, why you would use them or not. A lot of school districts have toned down or gotten rid of sex education. I don't know if find out what your school teaches, but that doesn't mean you can't teach and you can't make it an okay topic as a parent or suggest resources. But really the kids who know more about this were able to protect themselves better. So in the campus sexual assault problem, if your kids are going on to college, you need to know that's a risk. Kids who understand the basics about sex were less likely to have a sexual assault happen. Kids who had skills at saying no, of being drunk or not going into certain geographical places like a dorm room with a bed and no other chair when they're drunk, they had a better ability to resist and not be involved with sexual assault. So you want to give them some real life skills before they leave your home and your culture, and this is one way to do it, is to talk about it. Model for them peaceful conflict resolution. Show that if you and your other significant other or your mother-in-law or your neighbor or whoever other adult you're with aren't getting along, that you can talk about it in a peaceful way. You don't just avoid the conflict, but you name it, you talk about it, you resolve it. So the research on parental conflict for kids is it's bad if kids are exposed to parental conflict and the parents don't resolve that conflict. So if kids see their parents fighting or arguing or bickering and it never gets resolved, it stresses them out and it is a risk factor for depression, anxiety. Kids that see their parents argue, fight, and bicker, but they come up with a solution and then they stop, they actually learn how to be in a relationship and resolve conflict. So conflict in and of itself is not a bad thing. Learning how to manage it respectfully is a good thing. Okay, positive identity, personal power. Tell your kids they can really change the world. When they come home and they're bummed out and they're upset about so-and-so doesn't know how to teach science and, I could do a better job, say that would be a great profession for you. What would you do? Yes, you could make a difference. What would you do differently? Give them a sense of what their own personal power could be in the future and get them thinking that way so they know they have a goal ahead of them. Find ways for them to come up with goals and then achieve them, whatever they are. If they want to raise money for a charity and they want to sell something, support them in doing that. If they want to learn how to run a mile faster and they want to train for that, support them in that. But the process of setting a goal and achieving it is actually a great asset. This is one reason why kids who did Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, which aren't necessarily that popular these days, but one of the brilliant parts of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts was you got badges. And to get a badge, you had these 10 things you had to do. And if you did those 10 things, you got a badge, you learned a skill. It's a very concrete way of knowing I can set a goal, I can master something, I feel empowered. There are other ways to do it, but that's one way to do it. This sounds like a lot of information. Oh yeah, this is the other identity issue. You know, kids really you want your kid to feel like they have superpowers sometimes. You want them to feel good about themselves. And what does society do? Society and culture can say, well, this is wrong with you. You're not thin enough, or you're not pretty enough, or you're not smart enough, or you're not athletic enough, or whatever. It pokes holes in self-esteem. What you want to do is love your child just for being who they are and pointing out to them every day, you know, I really love that you tell jokes at dinner. You are so funny. You really make me laugh. Or I really love it that you take care of the dog so well. You are a really good dog owner and you're very responsible. Whatever they are doing well, catch them and tell them that. The ratio of how many positive comments any of us need before we'll even listen to one criticism is about 10 to 1. So if you want to criticize them for not cleaning their room, you got to come up with 10 other things they did well first to sandwich it, and then they're more willing to hear it and maybe listen to you. But if the balance is out of that, kids will shut down and tune out, or they'll feel bad about themselves. So kids are doing good things every day. You know, just pick it out and just tell them. That builds self-esteem. And a view of their personal future. You know, so again, talking about what turns them on, what do they want to do in life. The Search Institute calls these sparks, you know, kids that want to be the best guitar player ever. That's their spark. 80% of 15-year-olds report that they have a spark, something they really are passionate about, they really love, they really want to do. But only half of them, or a little over than half, feel like they get support from adults around them to do that. So look for that spark in their eye, whatever it is, even if it's not your favorite thing. Maybe they want to collect stamps. But if that's what turns them on, figure out ways to support them in doing it, because having a spark and being supported in it is a huge asset. So again, commitment to learning, positive values, social competence, positive identity, this is what makes your kid resilient. So when the Search Institute put this all together, they looked at thousands and thousands of teens, and they found that their sparks were one of the key things you want to look for. Their voice, that they could speak up, that they could say what was important to them, that they could say what they were afraid about, that they could voice what they would do to fix things. That really matters. And their relationships. If you want to boil it down to those 3 things, that's another way to do it. So in 2010, they interviewed, I think it was 4,000 15-year-olds. And those who had a lot of high levels of spark, voice, and relationships did better in every way, academically, psychologically, with their social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes. But a third of 15-year-olds didn't have any of those 3 things going for them. And only 7% had high levels of all 3 strengths. So again, helping increase their assets is going to help them succeed and increase their resiliency. They need positive, sustained relationships with adults. Even though they say they don't want to talk to you, they really do. They more or less, they want you to listen. And if not you, maybe their grandma, maybe the neighbor, maybe their coach, maybe their piano teacher. Find adults that they can have a positive relationship with. Only 19% thought that they had a meaningful supportive relationship with an adult in their life. That's kind of bleak, you know. If we want to raise kids, we are a community. So if you're good at some of these things, encourage your neighbor's kid, encourage your kid's friends. But together we need to be more involved with these kids' lives. Okay. The voice, being able to speak up, being able to be assertive. Only about a fifth of them felt they had that. So we have a ways to go to help our young people find their voice. There's a lot of action in our state right now on political advocacy by youth. Youth have been very involved with teaching other high school students not to smoke or the disadvantages of smoking tobacco. They're getting involved on levels of policy changes in the legislature. If you have an angsty kid who's mad about things, get them to pick one of those things that they're really going to work on. There are youth advocacy groups at Children's Hospital. You can find these groups where adults work with them as a group, but really their political voice speaks very loudly. Look at all these kids who did the walkout because we as adults aren't taking global climate change seriously enough. Those kids felt empowered. They had a voice. They're going to go somewhere with their lives. If you want more information, this is the website of the Search Institute. They have a lot of information on their website. They have questionnaires you can take, you have your child take, the school can take, all sorts of things to kind of assess where they're high in assets, where they're low in assets, come up with a plan of what you might want to help with. And those are called the Attitudes and Behavior Surveys. There's also a book one of the people from the Search Institute wrote called Sparks, which I think is really helpful. So if you're thinking about, let's find something positive and passionate in my child, it's a much better strategy than let's find everything they're doing wrong and stamp it out. You're going to make a lot more progress if you go with this kind of strategy. Okay, when do you need professional help? It's kind of this balancing act. If they're doing really well in physical, mental health, performance, athletics, whatever, and their stress is low, you probably can just talk this through with them and they don't need much. But if either they're not doing very well or their stress is really high, they just lost a family member, their house flooded, their best friend suicided right now, then you might want to get some professional help so that somebody can nurture you as a family to nurture your child. And we think about it as you want a certain level of stress and anxiety because it makes you more aroused. So if your stress level is too low, you're kind of bored, you're laying around, you're not doing much. That's not necessarily a good thing. Those kids don't succeed. If it's too high, you're anxious, you're so stressed, you're having panic attacks, you're choking on tests, that's not good either. So you want to find this kind of happy, optimal level of enough stress that you're going to stay up and study to do well on your test, but not so much that you're going to develop an eating disorder. So when do you seek help? If your child is telling you they're distressed, that's one thing to pay attention to. If they're having trouble functioning, they're not getting to school on time, they're not getting their homework done, they're not able to keep friendships, that's a problem. How often are these things happening? Is it every day? Is it just once in a month? How intense are they? How many things are they having problems with? And what's the duration? Most kids go through slumps. Most of us go through slumps. If it's just a few days they're having a slump, I'm not too worried. If it's 2 or 3 weeks in a row, that's getting to the duration that you might want to be concerned about. So one, again, your rules of parenting. It's complex, it's challenging to be a parent, but it really is one of the most rewarding professions of life. So, if you have the attitude that I'm not perfect, I gotta be good enough, I'm learning how to do this, I'm gonna love them a lot, I'm gonna leave them alone, which means things like natural consequences and not, bailing them out of everything, letting them do their own work, learn their responsibilities. I'm gonna set a good example. Your kids are probably gonna be pretty resilient. All right.
Really appreciate the turnout tonight. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different lens in the sense that I was asked to talk more about transitions and what goes into thriving in transitions, which does kind of go along with that idea of how do we help be resilient, but it's going to be a little bit of a focus rather than the larger parenting view. Think of it a little more of a personal view. So in that sense, this is sort of what we talk a lot about being successful in the trenches. What do I have conversations with kids who are moving to new schools, a lot of kids going off to college, making changes? How do we do that? And so I grew up in the world of the military and education, and if you don't have an acronym, it's not real. So I had to figure out a good acronym, and I was playing with it, and in that way, in basketball, an assist is dropping a dime. And so I want to assist you today and drop some dimes in that way of how to help really figure out how to be successful in these sorts of transitions in our life. So the first thing to kind of think about in transitions, we're going to talk about in this way, and you can pull out your sheet because it can walk you along in that way too. But the first thing is to see this as a wonderful opportunity point. And again, so much anxiety revolves around transition, but transition and really helping think about it's a time for reflection and a time for reinvention. So the first thing you want to think about in that idea of inventing yourself or the possibility of reinventing yourself is slowing down and thinking about values. What do I care about? What kind of experiences do I want to have in this transition? What do I want, whatever that transition might be? Who are the people I want to be around? Who do I want to meet? How do I want to, I always challenge people to see it as an opportunity to step out in a new way, to try something new. And sort of playing on that basketball metaphor, I used to play a lot of basketball, and my coach used to say, if you can picture it, you can achieve it. If you can't picture it, that's where you start. And before you start a transition, I want to encourage you to start picturing. What do you want that to look like? How do you want it to go well? And that's sort of that first kind of thing, and there's some questions in there to help guide that, but also questions you can be talking with your teen, your child in that way of what do they want these experiences to be a good transition. And in that sense too, we know a lot from the literature, besides just transitioning or thinking about transitions, a key component of transitions is the term called integration. How much do we get involved? And I have the image of a plant up there, or a tree in that sense, because if you think about it, trees survive and thrive when they have multiple sources of nourishment, when they're not getting all their nourishment from one spot. Because, in that sense, if you're only dependent on the sunshine and there's a cloudy day or a period of clouds, you're in trouble. But if you have good roots, if you have other ways to get that, you're going to be buffered and bolstered through some of the difficulties in transitions, and also in that sense of resiliency. So here are the areas that you can think about in terms of integration. First, you can think about social. What kind of clubs, what kind of groups, what people do I want to get involved with? And also then too, academics. What kind of courses do I want to take? What do I want to learn about? And that can be in the classroom or out of the classroom. If you move somewhere, I want to learn guitar. This is that opportunity. I just moved here. Let's get involved and learn something. Also, we can get involved early on too, starting to have those conversations about career, job, getting integrated. One of the things most of the time I work with seniors who I ask them, and that's why they usually come to me at that time of their life, because it's a big transition, and they knew how to do school, but they don't know how to do this thing called adulting. And I ask them, well, have you been to the Career Center? And they haven't been. And sort of in that way, already thinking sort of the first thing you might want to do in a transition is start finding places to integrate, start having jobs, start meeting, networking with people, and starting that process to integrate. And then we want to think of that, I call it the category of self, but my physical and emotional health, and also my identity. A lot of times in transition, it's a great time to do some soul searching. Do I value religion? Do I care about that? What do I know about being a male? What do I know about being Caucasian? What about my sexuality? And to start finding yourself and integrating and understanding those parts of your identity. And then really too, integrating more and thinking about family. And especially if that transition is moving away from family, I call it starting to think about family of choice. Having sisters and brothers in college, having sisters from another mother, things like that, but finding ways to have some of that integration. And these are the things we want to start thinking about when we reinvent ourselves, when we think of ourselves, but thinking of what we need and already planning and having some game plans of what we want to do. But we know integration is really a predictor for thriving. And so these are those areas you want to kind of start focusing on. Clicker. Another thing in that sense of what makes successful transitions is there's a lot of work on this idea called mindsets. How do we approach things? How do we get involved? And sort of I really thought about this and kind of I see that there's 4 important mindsets for successful transitions. And the first mindset, I call it the new person in town mindset. And that new person in town mindset, when you're new to something, it gives a lot of people that freedom to step out when anxiety gets in the way. Hey, I just moved here. Do you know a good restaurant? Hey, what do you think of this teacher? I just got here. What do you think of this? It sort of is a built-in excuse that helps you go up to people and sort of freeing yourself that they don't know you. They're not thinking of that way that you used to. And so embracing that mindset for yourself and freeing yourself to keep moving forward and asking in that sense and having that freedom to be new and embrace it. Another mindset is, again, when we do these transitions and changes, we want to have a preparing mindset. A beautiful quote I love is, chance favors the prepared mind. And so that's why this preemptive work of not just transitioning, but being thoughtful beforehand about what you want to achieve, doing that research. If you want to get socially integrated at a school, I always talk to kids before they get there. Do you know what clubs are on campus? Do you know how to join that club? Do you know when that club meets? Do you know where they meet? Have you reached out? Or in that way, doing some of that pre-homework to be successful. And then a big thing, I also call it, again, there's a beautiful researcher I love, her name is Carol Dweck, and she talks about this idea of a growth mindset. And people who have this sort of mindset, they see that everything is about learning. And so they look for learning opportunities because I'm not born smart, I get smart. And so that growth mindset, they like to try new things because it's not a sense of I am either good at that or not, I get good. So they say yes to things. And that's so important in transitions. What I talk about is learning to say yes. And we had a rule when we moved to Denver. We had to say yes to anything as long as it didn't conflict with something else we were doing. And that ability to say yes and be welcoming and people embrace you in a different way. So that's a really important mindset. The last one I talk a lot about is this idea of a seasonal mindset. Going back, it's really hard to be doing everything full force. And we in this country get this belief that we can do everything 110%. But that's impossible. It's impossible to do everything 110%. So what I call is sort of start thinking a little more seasonally. And in that idea being about 3 or 4 times a year, slowing down and looking back at these things and thinking, what do I want to prioritize in this season? Wow, I've been so caught up at work. I've kind of neglected my family a little bit. So this season, I'm going to intentionally let work know I'm not going to be as available as much and I'm going to spend a little more time with my kids. Or it could be, you know what? It was the holidays, I spent so much time with family, spent so much time trying to balance work. I haven't worked out or taken care of myself at all. This season, I'm going to prioritize that. And I'm going to set expectations around that, both internally for myself, and we'll talk about that next, but I'm going to also let the world know and be successful in that season. And a lot of times when people make transitions, especially academic ones, is starting to think about that. When I first get there, what do I want to prioritize? Maybe it's a little more in the social integration from the get-go. And then after the first 3 or 4 weeks, when I've prioritized that, then maybe I have to shift gears a little bit and put a little more energy into the academic side. But learning to think a little more seasonally and having flexibility is really important in those transitions. So now we've talked about, again, the idea of reinventing yourself, the idea of integrating, the right mindset, and then what comes with that is learning to set expectations. And part of that expectation setting you'll think about is both for yourself, but also with the people you care about, the people who are in that world. So kids who are our parents, if you have a kid going off to college, and that transition, being clear, as Dr. Wamboldt talked about, of what are realistic expectations for how often should we talk when you're in college? What is my boundary to talk about with you? How can I support you with what you want to do? And also in that way, learning to set realistic expectations for what you can achieve in a certain time. So many people come in with that expectation, I'm going to get to college, I'm going to have my best friends from week 1, I'm going to know all my teachers, it's going to be great. Have realistic expectations for what you can do for yourself in a week of time being in a new environment. What friendships should look like after a week. And starting to think more about expectations, but really facilitating expectations. So in your sheet, you'll think about, I have a list of what are the expectations I want to be thinking about, but then who should I start having those conversations with? And as parents, you can start facilitating those conversations with your teen, with your adolescent at any age, of what are those expectations around these kind of different things. And then the last thing, and I think this is a lost art, is we've lost the art of understanding we're not the first person to walk a path. And there's been people who've done this path before, and finding mentors, seeking them out, getting more guidance, and especially when things are tough, where do I go to for support? Knowing that, and maybe establishing that early in a transition so that you have someone who can help be a support during that time and really help in that way. And I have that picture in that way of a pathway, that people have walked that pathway before and learned to talk to them. And this is especially true for college students and in that way, or high school, or when you transition to a new academic environment, is moving away to this idea that there is one way to study. There's one method of success. And actually, that's very classroom specific. Every teacher has a different thing that they think is important. They have a different definition of what success looks like in this class. So if the teacher has that in their head, back to Dr. Wamboldt's slide, and you want to figure that information out, what do you have to do? You have to go talk to them and ask. And what a lot of students make the mistake is they take the first test because they didn't have this conversation, they do really poorly, and then they figure it out and revise their strategy of successful studying, and then they're playing catch up. How much better would it be if they go the first day of class or early on, I want to do well in your class. What do you recommend how I study? What do you find important that you test on? And understanding that's pretty idiosyncratic, and if you learn that early on, instead of playing catch up, you are now ahead of the game and you're thriving from the get-go. And that kind of falls under this idea of learning instead of trying to do it all on your own, learning how to ask and find people. And I talk a lot about this too, especially with youth, and finding careers. And as you as parents, expose them to people who have all sorts of things around their spark or passion. Help them get connected. Help them talk to those people. How did you get your job? What would you recommend doing? And there's a great thing they're doing in the psychology world right now is every week I get an email from people who are doing the most creative things, working in the MBA, working at a Fortune 500 company. And the title of the presentation is, how did you get that job? But we're learning in that way, we need to help forge these connections. We need mentors. And so on the sheet is sort of where you might want to start thinking about mentors both in that way for your children, where they might find it, but also for yourself. And in that sense, parenting is hard. Who can I talk to? Who's going to help guide me? Who can mentor me? Who do I think is doing a great job in their parenting that I can reach out and sort of ask them, how are you doing this? What's going well? So starting to think a little more in that sense. We're not alone in more community. And how do we leverage our larger community for success, for that integration? So in that sense, I want to again empower you to start dropping those dimes with others and building in that way. But again, we already talked about that idea of what if it's not going well? Again, Dr. Wamboldt started talking about, but your job is to recognize when things aren't going well and to really start catching those early warning signs. And some of those are changes in mood, changes in appearance, not just sort of I'm figuring myself out, but if I stop caring about things I used to care about. Again, a big indicator is seeing if sleep is impacted and some of these changes in appetite, and if they're just not acting like themselves. Let that be an early warning sign, but also maybe have that conversation if a transition is coming up, a big one. Where are you going to go to for support? How can you start recognizing those in yourself? And then know, part of why we give these talks is that we want to be your back in the community for helping you and your child be successful in transitions and being resilient. And so we're always here to kind of help in that way. So again, I know this was short and brief, but one thing I like to do to make sure a little bit of learning has occurred, I call it the stoplight model. And I use the stoplight in various ways, but I'd love to hear one thing maybe based on my talk or Dr. Wamboldt's talk that you're going to reflect right now on your own parenting and go, okay, I might stop doing that in my parenting. And then one thing, you might pat yourself on the back that you're going to keep doing. I'm glad I'm doing that. You know, that family dinner time, or that we volunteer once a month. I'm going to keep that. I like that. I'm glad there's some evidence and support. That's a good idea. Or one thing based on today you might start doing to help your teen or help yourself in transitions or building resiliency. And then we'll open it up to questions. But again, I'm going to trap you all in here, keep you in here till I know some learning has occurred. So can anyone share one thing they might stop doing based on today? Thank you. Yes, I should have candy. Let me just throw it out.
So I'll do a keep doing and a start doing. Well, the keep doing, we always have family dinners, so I love that. We'll keep doing that. And then the start doing, I love what you said about pointing out a good thing that they've done, because I realize that I'm probably nagging my teenager way too much without saying more just simple positive things. So I really like that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, I think I want to stop being so critical. I think I do that too much,
Mm-hmm.
which goes with the start. You know, I think that's all they hear sometimes. I think
Beautiful.
you're just trying to teach, but it sounds too critical.
Right. And what I'll say, and I love that, and I'll just jump on that. A, to remember Dr. Wamboldt sharing that 10-to-1 ratio. But B, remember my world, or what I work with the most, is anxiety. So a lot of times parents think they're helping their kids with anxiety by pointing out all the things to be anxious about or all the things that can go wrong, especially in this current environment with what we're dealing with. And if you already have a kid and you've given them the gift of your genetics of anxiety, and then you keep reinforcing what to be anxious about, what do you think is going to happen in the long run? So I'm not saying not to have the conversation about what could go wrong and how to prepare, but balance that with what can go right. Balance that with what they're doing well, what you like, what is positive, and really in that way, think about that bank account in your own mind as a parent. And am I putting more positive, or every time I fight or throw something they should be worried about or dangerous, I'm pulling from that bank account? And if I have a lot of money in the bank account, it's not a big deal. But if we're running on empty or low, it's a huge deal when I withdraw. Yes?
So I'll be honest, but I think what I'm gonna stop doing is my son
Mm.
Like, what, a good career that will give you a decent wage and so that you don't have to come back and live with family definition of success. And backing up and giving him more independence, leaving him alone, and maybe nurturing his sparks
Oh.
instead. Yeah.
I love it, and thank you all. And I will say that too. I'll end with an inspiring quote. One of the quotes I live by is by Robert F. Kennedy, who said, "Some people see the world and say, why? I choose to dream of a world and say that never was and say, why not?" I butchered the quote. I'm going to do it one more time. Some people see the world as it is and say, why? I choose to dream of a world that never was and say, why not? I was closer. I know I'm still off, but we're getting closer. And we'll both come up if you have any questions before we wrap up. And you all have been great.
Yes.
I have a teeny.
Anxiety is a chronic illness. Depression is a chronic illness. Diabetes is a chronic illness. Rheumatoid arthritis is a chronic illness. Migraines are a chronic illness. Bad teeth can be a chronic illness. Bad knees can be a chronic illness. We all have something that is our weak spot that we have to be a little more careful about so it doesn't act up and bother us. That doesn't mean that has to define us. We still want to have our life, and we want to put the illness in its place, is something we call. So yes, she may have a tendency to get more anxious. We know half of what makes people anxious is genetic. We can't really control that. It comes from our genes. But she can certainly learn how to live with it and cope with it in a way that it doesn't impede what she wants to do anymore. And maybe that didn't get defined as well. We treat lots of people with anxiety disorders who are thriving, who are succeeding at school and sports and all sorts of things because they've learned the skills that they need to manage what makes them afraid. And sometimes one of the tools is medication, sometimes for a short time, sometimes for a longer time, but anxiety is an illness, but it's a very manageable illness, and she should be able to learn how to deal with it so it doesn't interfere with who she is or wants to be.
So how do we help her not define herself with the anxiety?
We don't get into all the specifics, but I'm sure she's doing something well. So you see her and you say, "Melinda, boy, that new hairstyle you tried makes you look so beautiful." Or, "Melinda, wow, I know it was really hard for you to talk to that new kid at school, but you picked up the phone and talked to him. I'm really proud of you." You focus on what she's doing well as opposed to what she's not doing right. And if you think about any of us, we do better with a coach who is saying, I've had bad piano teachers and I have good piano teachers. The bad piano teachers would hit me on my hands when I played the wrong note, and all that did was make me really freaked out about playing the wrong note. The good piano teachers would say, "Wow, all right, you relaxed your shoulder, you're getting a much better tone. Listen to what you figured out how to do." We all need more positive comments than negative. It's a very common issue, and the rates of anxiety disorders are actually rising with every birth cohort. When they've scientifically surveyed people in a variety of countries, people born in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, all the way up to now, each decade actually has increased rates of anxiety. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it may be if you listen to too much news, it's going to make anybody anxious. So limit that. I don't watch TV news anymore because I know it'll just get me riled up for no good reason. I could read it because then I could titrate how much I want to read at a time. So you might also think about what are the inputs that are keeping her anxiety high. That's another strategy. Scott had one that I was on the tip of my tongue. I was going to say what you said about the transitions and I just lost it. But these are treatable problems. We see these a lot. We see them all the time, and many people do get better. Most people do. It's not always easy. It's kind of like you have to do physical therapy to keep your knee in shape if you have a bad knee, and if you stop doing it, you're going to relapse, and if you do it again, you're going to feel better. Working on anxiety is similar to that. You have to kind of keep at it.
And I'll throw out a shameless plug, but if you go to our website, I give a talk on anxiety and anxiety disorders and what effective treatment looks like and what needs to be in place, and that might be a wonderful resource for you to go to. to help you understand what you want to look for in good anxiety treatment and what are all those skills entailed. But perfectionism is a huge issue in anxiety right now, especially for kids in this environment. And so they're not alone, but it's also, as Dr. Wamboldt said, one of the most treatable conditions we know how, and we're the most effective at. A research study came out of 30 years of research. We're the best now at treating anxiety disorders in the mental health field.
So, is your website in this packet?
It should be. If you go to our website, the Helen Arthur, so we have the Toolkit series, but we have one on depression, and I gave one on anxiety, and one on how to recognize issues in your teens and what to do about it.
ColoradoDepressionCenter.org.
ColoradoDepressionCenter.org, thank you.
Another good resource for anxiety is the ADAA.org, which is the Anxiety Disorders of America website, and they have some excellent resources as well. So both of those are helpful. Yes, back there?
And then I also, for anxiety, like IOCD.org.
Other questions?
I'll chime in a sense, and I was sharing this before. We teach our kids math, we teach our kids English, we teach our kids history, but then we think when it comes to these things like social skills, good luck. And so think of it in that way, in the same way like mental health, but how can I teach this? And to know the beauty of today's age, and what I love about it, is there's nothing you can't learn from a Google search. There's nothing. And I trust that you can be a disseminator if you take a little time to figure out what's a good resource versus bad, but you can start talking to them about, or booking when you work with them, what are some of their challenges in making friends, where do they struggle, and helping have conversations and teach them how to do it and practice with them. But that's also where therapists like myself come in. There's so much time we spend teaching how do I interact, and especially with devices, there's not as much need. So there's not that same practice or skill of how do I carry a conversation that's not with the text? How do I make eye contact? So we have to learn to teach, and that will be one of the things I'd encourage you all to see. If you see something that you're not enjoying with your teen, slow down and ask yourself or your child, have I taught them? Do they know how? And not just keep punishing them for not knowing, teach them. So that would be my take. But I'll also want to keep opening up to questions and defer to you, but maybe if we can move away from more sort of my client or case or kid and more general questions, and feel free to come up after around more personal questions.
Clear and concise. It depends on the age of the child. I've heard some parents of very young kids, like first graders, just told them the school didn't open because the plumbing was broken. That's probably okay for that age. For a high schooler, they're probably reading the news, middle schooler, etc. Okay, so the system worked. We had somebody who was pretty disturbed. It's too bad she didn't get treatment herself. But between her parents, between the police, between the FBI, they figured out she might put you at risk. And you know what? No one else was put at risk. It's really tragic that she was killed, but we have learned. Now, I don't know how many of you have listened to the podcast on Columbine, 20 years post-Columbine, that CPR has been putting out, Colorado Public Radio. But they've interviewed a lot of people about, what did we learn from these tragedies and how do we better prevent them from happening? And a lot of things went right in that case, from what I understand. They picked up that she had a number of airline tickets, one-way tickets. Her parents might have let the police know they were worried about her. The police in Florida communicated with the FBI in Denver. So a lot of parts of the community worked well. And the point that one of the researchers on school violence made is, we are actually finding out about preventing and stopping more of these episodes now than we were able to do 20 years ago. And by and large, they are still very rare. So yes, they're scary, but your chances of getting hit in a car accident are probably higher than your chances of being in a school shooting, and yet you drive every day. So at some point, your brain has to make the balance of, yes, there are risks. This is where the resiliency is helpful. Can I be aware? Can I be one of the people who bring that change to the world? So if I see a kid in my class who seems like they're really bummed out, or bullied, some of the risk factors, and they're acting angry, what do I do to help befriend that person or get them help or bring them to the attention of the adults in my life so that they don't become a school shooter? So the more we have things that we can actually do that make the situation better, the less anxious we become. If that's helpful. Those would be some of the ways I talk to a high school student about it.
Yeah. And I'll also throw out to recognize that this is a wonderful opportunity to start a conversation. It's not the end of a conversation. It's the start of a conversation around issues of wellness, the spectrum of mental health, around how they're taking care of themselves, their own view of the world. And again, you want to think about the age of the child you're with and what you're sharing at the right age level. But it's a conversation to start having, and how do I prepare you for the world and not spare you from it, but help you do well in it. And that's part of the encourage the conversation, and how it might start is as simple as, what have you heard? What do you think about it? What are you thinking? And what are your concerns? And hearing that and then responding to that, but then opening that door. I think as a family, we probably should talk about this more often, not just about the tragic side, but how do we make sure we're doing okay? How do we check in on our own health and our own way we're thinking about things and make sure that we're doing well? So please don't see this as a one-shot conversation, and please use this opportunity. Don't shy away from it. Go for it. And you don't have to have all the answers. Feel free to say, that's a good question. Let me think about it and get back to you. And then call someone, call a friend, a parent that you think is great, or one of us, and say, how do I respond to this?
Okay, well, one of the things you've all done, and I hope you keep doing, is you're learning how to be a better parent, and you're participating in a child-related activity to help you do that. So as far as Scott's, was it the yellow light, keep going?
Yeah.
Keep doing it? Keep learning more. I mean, parenting, I always say parenting is a humbling experience. You're not really taught how to do it. Most of us, if you happen to be lucky and you were born to a spectacular mom and dad who taught you these things, great, but most of us didn't have that experience. They're all things in our background that were good, but maybe not perfect. So the construct is you want to be good enough. You don't have to be a perfect parent. You want to be good enough. Usually that is good enough for your kids. But you can learn a lot of these skills and tricks. So you did a great job coming today to listen to us on a somewhat stressful day, and it's late. We don't want to keep you too late. So we will say thank you now. If you have personal issues you want to, or individual questions, we can hang around a little bit longer, but I think we'll let the whole group go.